OACNFers, the front runner, as you know, strides into the fall, and I have a couple events coming up in September. September 20th at the Coos Bay Public Library for an author talk at 2 p.m. September 21st, I'll be in Portland in conversation at the Oregon Historical Society at 2 p.m. And on September 27th, I will be a featured author alongside Ruby McConnell for the Florence Festival of Books. And in Florence, it's all day, but the conversation is at 4:30 p.m. I have a total of 4 little things lined up in Idaho the first week of October, but I'll clue you into those as we get closer to those days. So stay clued into my newsletters and BrendanOmero.com. Hey. And secondarily on Instagram at Creative Nonfiction Podcast. Wouldn't you know, the call for submissions is open. The audio magazine is back. Codes is the theme. The Mandalorian and his kind live by a simple code, always punctuated by, this is the way. What codes do you live by? What codes were you at one time or another told to live by? Has a code led you to the right path or the wrong? Essays should be no longer than 2,000 words, a 15-minute read. Bear in mind that in the end, these are audio essays. Write accordingly. Short sentences. Uncomplicated words. Not many syllables. Email submissions with codes in the subject line to creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com. Originally, previously unpublished work only, please. Deadline's October 31st, 2025. There's cash on the line from the Omera grant, so send me your best, fully formed pieces, and consider becoming a patron to help put money in the coffers that helps put money in the pockets of writers. We gotta have that burrito money.
You need to write, you need to read, and you need to talk about reading and writing.
Okay, CNFers. So on this email chain for 2 signings I'm doing in Ketchum, Idaho, one of the guys was like, can you check your Amazon link to make sure it's okay? I said, I'll trust it's okay because I haven't looked at Amazon or Goodreads, and that will lead me down a one-way road to Bummerville. So then my friend Kim betrayed me with a separate email that said, I'm going to force good news on you. And it's a screenshot of 106 ratings on Amazon for an average of 4.6 and 228 ratings for an average of 4.4 on Goodreads. She said anything above 4.0 on Goodreads is really good. I think I owe a lot of that to you for rallying behind the book. Now, I'm still not going to go read any of them, but I guess the book is landing with people. It's hard for me to maybe admit that it might be good, and that's why it's getting good ratings. Now, therapy, is it too late to start? Mallary Tenore Tarpley is here today. Oh, by the way, it's a Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to tellers of true tales about the true tales they tell. I'm Brendan O'Mara. But then again, you knew that, right? Right? Again, Mallary Tenore Tarpley is here for a double feature Friday. I'm sorry I occasionally dump 2 episodes on you on a Friday. I realize that a flood of these podcasts probably overwhelms and stresses you out, and you're like, oh my God, how can I listen to all this shit? Will you stop doing this? Fuck that guy. Just know that I'm twice as stressed, trying to get through this backlog of interviews and honor the guests who came on the show in a somewhat timely manner. She's the author of Slip, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. It's published by Simon & Schuster / Simon Element, an imprint, something. It's pretty heavy shit, man. She developed a disordered relationship to food when her mother passed away from cancer when she was just 11 years old. Mallary spent years in treatment, and the book blends her personal story with the ballast of science and outward-facing reporting. It's Memoir-Plus, as it was pitched. We'll call it Memoir Max. Show notes to this episode and more at BrendanOmero.com. Hey, there you can peruse hot blogs, tasteful nudes, and sign up for my 2 very important newsletters, the flagship Rage Against the Algorithm and Pitch Club. Issue 4, this with Cassidy Randall, dropped like it was hot. It's pretty great. Would love for Pitch Club to catch fire. I might be buying some ad space in the Sunday SLR, the Sunday long read newsletter put on by Jacob Feldman and Dawn Van Natta. Let's keep doing it. Maybe I'm going to be lining up some book pitches and agent pitches, radio pitches, doc film pitches, maybe my Prefontaine proposal, maybe my next book proposal. If and when it sells, it'll sell. It has to sell. Yeah, it's going to sell. Pitch Club will never cost a dime. I'll never gatekeep like that. I'm not a monster. Someone pledged $25 and maybe I'll turn on pledges at some point. Kind of like Patreon, I guess. Not the AC, I don't charge for the podcast, but people put money in the coffers, like kind of a tip jar kind of thing. Maybe I'll do that with the pledges on Substack. I don't know, but it's not this day. All I ask is for your permission because really, platform is currency. Both are first of the month, no spam. So far as I can tell, you can't beat them. Also, hosted my first Patreon Ask Me Anything AMA last night. How did it go? I don't know. I'm tracking this intro before it happened. I am playing in two different temporal worlds, man. We'll just say it was awesome and well attended. If you want to join the next one, visit patreon.com/CNFpod to learn more. All right, one last thing. We got a new review over on Apple Podcasts. Love these. Anytime I get them, I read them. And this one is from Man in Progress. 4 stars. Titled Too Much. All the interjections in this show destroy the flow of the interviews, as well as any illusion of intimacy. Well, Man in Progress, I went through a phase where I was doing those interjections, those little asides to provide context or whatever, but I don't do them anymore. It's been a long time, so you must have been listening during a particular pocket of the show. But you're probably gone now. But if you stick around, they're not there anymore. So cool. Okay, enough of that housekeeping bullshit. You must hate it. But then I have to remind myself that not everyone listens to every episode. So I have to be very repetitive. And a lot of this is so goddamn repetitive to me. But like I said, for some of you, you might only be hearing it for like the 3rd or 4th time. And then you zip away and maybe you don't listen again for 20 more of these episodes. There are some people out there, I don't know, like Tracy. You listen to most. Anyway, Mallory's been on the hustle, man, for Slip. She's everywhere. She's posting. She's newslettering. She's beating the drum. She's an example of what a modern author must do in this age. I'd say take a look at what she's doing and maybe cherry pick what works for you. But speaking from experience, really nobody's going to do it for you. You got to be your own advocate. You might have some resources in your corner, but by and large, 95% of it is on your ass. She graduated from Providence College and earned an MFA in creative nonfiction from Goucher College. Creative nonfiction. Where have I heard that term? And that's where she started this manuscript for Slip that would become Slip. She worked with my dear friend Maggie Messett on it for a bit. Now Mallory is an assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas, where she teaches journalism classes. She started her career at the Poynter Institute, where she would become the managing editor of the website, poynter.org. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Teen Vogue, Neiman Storyboard, and she has a Substack, don't we all, called Right at the Edge. It's a good play on words. Go check it out at Mallary.substack.com. You can also learn more about her at MalloryTenoreTarpley.com and follow her on LinkedIn or Instagram as well. On this podcast, we talk about platform and publicity, how she vetted out a freelance publicist to supplement the publisher team, staying power in this line of work, and some of her best memories working alongside Roy Peter Clark at Poynter. Stick around for a parting shot on the eating disorder I invented in college. I don't know why I'm going to share what I'm going to share, but it seems germane to this conversation. But it's up to you if you care to listen or not. Let's cue up the riff. Huh.
The writing part is where the magic is for me. The kids these days.
You know, there's a difference between losing and being a loser.
I either work on it or I allow it to torture me for a really long time.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
It's always great to get the insights of a writer like yourself of those that nonlinear path, but also just there's never a wasted word, really. I mean, we can just kind of dovetail right into the conversation if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that totally works. Yeah, I love talking about this stuff. So yeah, it reminds me of Danny Shapiro, her last novel, Signal Fires. She said that it just stemmed from a novel she'd written that had just been sitting in a drawer for quite some time. And then she thought, I need to revisit this. And so you never know kind of what's going to happen with those novels that get stuck in drawers.
Oh, 100%. Like I remember, it's so much of it comes down to luck and timing, and luck plays into timing, or timing plays into luck. I submitted this essay, 2015, 2016, to Barrel House, because it was kind of like a funny, irreverent, as a middle school essay. The Gentleman's Guide to Arousal-Free Slow Dancing was the name. It was about my 8th grade dinner dance. And, they passed on it. But then Creative Nonfiction magazine opened up like a contest for a theme called Joy. And I submitted it to that. I had always wanted to be published there. And then this particular issue comes up, and the theme matched up with my essay, and they took it. And so I was like tickled by that. But so it's just kind of a luck thing. Like I was thinking it would go in one direction, and then happenstance, this other place opens up and they decide to take it, and it was perfect. So it's just that it's that degree of perseverance and knowing that nothing is ever truly wasted.
Exactly. I know. I think about just all the iterations of my book and just all the versions I wrote along the way. And I'm glad that they never saw the light of day, because looking back on them now, they were not particularly well written, at least by my standards today, but they were all stepping stones, and they all really helped pave a pathway forward for me. And you can see glimmers of them in my actual book. So I agree that those words aren't wasted, even if you don't end up actually using them or repurposing them.
So I need you to tell me your best Roy Peter Clark story.
Oh, funny. Oh my gosh. Well, there are a lot of them. Well, there's so many. I mean, I used to go with him to all these different establishments in St. Petersburg, and he would often take me to lunch at Pizza Hut. So, Pizza Hut is where we did a lot of our storyboarding, and he would get out napkins, and then he would start just sort of outlining stories on them or writing out different ideas. And so we'd be splitting a deep dish pan pizza and talking about stories. Another time, he knew that I really liked to sing, and he always incorporates music into his teaching. And so one time he took me to a place called Biff Burger, where I did some karaoke of Carrie Underwood and sang on stage to a big biker crowd.
Oh my God.
And then he's in the audience playing the air guitar and just cheering me on. And so it was always interesting just to see kind of like the social life and the musical life and the writing life, like all somehow were always intertwining. But he and his wife were kind of like surrogate parents to me when I moved down there, because I was fresh out of college and didn't know anybody else. So they really showed me around, which I loved.
Oh, well, the Providence College connection must have helped.
Yeah, it definitely did. I met him first at a writers conference because I kind of stalked him out. I was trying to look for other PC grads who had gone off to do journalism, and of course came upon him and reached out to him via email and saw he was going to be at a writers conference in Connecticut. So then decided to register for it and met him there, and he encouraged me to apply to the Poynter Institute. So just kind of, went from there.
I was set to go to PC.
Really?
Yeah, to play baseball
Oh.
there. And in 1999, when I graduated high school, southeastern Massachusetts, so we have Mass connection. The following year they cut their baseball program. In 2000, there was like a whole hullabaloo around that. It was a lot of like Title IX reshuffling. And they decided to cut their baseball program, like their historic program. And I was just like really bummed out, because I was a shortstop, and a good friend of mine who I played summer ball with was a second baseman. He was going to go to Providence as well. So we were like this sort of double play tandem. Gonna go enroll, be a PC Friar, and play some D1 ball, but then they cut the program, and it was a bummer, because that would have been a good fit for both of us. So yeah, we almost had another connection with Providence.
I know, that would have been so neat. PC and Goucher. And yeah, I was thinking that maybe you were from Massachusetts because you kept saying draw. And for the longest time, I said draw instead of drawer. And then when I moved to Texas, I realized nobody understood what I was saying.
Yeah, it comes out from time to time, my Boston accent, and I watch it over and over again because it is such a pitch perfect Boston skit. Is the Casey Affleck Dunkin' Donuts SNL skit. It is, he nails it. It is so perfect. Like, cut your nails for God's sake. And like when everyone like the way he said "for," like it's just like for God's sake, like that is just like so pitch perfect Massachusetts right there. It's very subtle, but you get that right. I mean, you're onto something.
Yeah, I know. It's very true. I never really got the Boston accent because we were in the suburbs and my parents didn't really have strong accents, but I can definitely appreciate it and recognize it.
Yeah. Well, when you had those lunches with Peter, well, with Roy, what as you're like a young burgeoning writer and journalist, what were in working with him, what were those? What did those conversations do to you? And what were you taking away?
Yeah, so Roy taught me that to be a better writer, you need to do three things. You need to write, you need to read, and you need to talk about reading and writing. And for me, he was really the person with whom I talked about reading and writing. So we would talk about books that we'd read. We would talk about just reading Chaucer when we were both at Providence College. We would talk about just the stories that I was working on for Pointer's website. And that was incredibly helpful to just be able to bounce story ideas off of him, to talk with him about different challenges that I was facing, whether it was while writing a lead or trying to figure out how to structure a story. And so that act of conversing about the written word really gave me just the freedom to not only be thinking about writing, but to actually be in conversation about it. And those conversations, I think, really helped me to improve because as we would talk, he would impart all this wisdom on me and he would be sharing all of his different tools around emphatic word order and getting the name of the dog, right? Always looking for different details when you're writing. I remember one time I had shown him a piece of my writing and we were talking about it together. And I had this line in there that said something was firmly rooted. And he said, well, how else would it be rooted? He said, we don't need that adverb in there. And so from then on, I never used that phrase firmly rooted, but he would always help me to just question every word that I was using, making sure I wasn't excessively using adjectives or adverbs, and really just helping me to think about my writing as this living, breathing entity that could always be improved upon.
It's one of those things too, like coming up as journalists, we're very cognizant of word count. And so, yeah, like throwing in those extra modifiers, it just helps bloat up that word count when you're so desperate to get to it. But yeah, it's one of those things. Yeah, you go through and you start to see like an editor, read like an editor. And yeah, when you see something that's redundant like that, firmly rooted, of course, like, yeah, you can't really be not firmly rooted. And I guess you can in some very rare circumstances, but by and large, the metaphor is going to be like structurally sound. So yeah, it's one of those deals. Well, it's one of those lessons you learn early on just through the sheer repetition of it all.
Definitely. Yeah. And I felt really lucky to just have a mentor like that and someone who I could talk to about writing because I just went right into my first job at the Poynter Institute after graduating college. So I didn't study journalism in college, even though I was editor of the school newspaper and always practiced journalism and internships. But I didn't have a real formal education around it. So to be able to work in a place where those conversations were encouraged was really formative for me as a young writer.
Yeah, and I remember like your name was familiar to me from like, you would moderate these Pointer things where like Roy would spend an afternoon, like an hour, kind of answering questions or something, and you were kind of the moderator on the side. So this must have been like 2009, 2010, 2011, around there. So of course, you've noted what you've learned from Roy, but being sort of a wingman to those sessions and hearing the concerns of other writers and reporters, what did you take away from that experience hearing the community talk into the Pointer bullhorn or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I really learned was that you always are trying to improve your craft no matter how many years you've been in the business. So I remember just thinking that we would bring in these seasoned journalists, and I would often just wonder what I would have to contribute to the conversation, because we had these folks from the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR who would be coming in as guests to talk with Roy in these chats. And very often they would be asking for my input on something. And that made me think, well, one, they want to continue to learn, even though they've been in the business for 20 plus years. But two, maybe I actually have something to offer as a young journalist. And that was really refreshing for me. Also, to be a younger journalist editing Roy Peter Clark and editing all these other journalism greats who worked at the Poynter Institute helped me realize that there could be this really interesting writer-editor relationship that wasn't sort of defined by age so much as an opportunity and willingness to learn. So I would always learn something new as I was editing these journalists' work. And in turn, they showed me that they were learning something from me, because as a young editor, I was bringing a different perspective to the piece and the way that I read and edited it. And that inspired confidence in me to the point where at a very young age, I was probably 23, I was starting to teach journalists who came to the Poynter Institute for training how to use social media as a reporting and writing tool, because I was very much interested in social media as a young person, whereas a lot of other folks who had been in the industry for a while were quite skeptical of it. So being in that position to actually teach seasoned journalists was quite helpful, because again, it made me feel more confident in my ability, but it also helped me to just feel like I could be in a position where I was continuously learning and also teaching at the same time.
I'm glad you brought up social media. That was something I wanted to talk to you about, because you've been on the hustle for Slip for a while, like really building a foundation for it. And it's something I've like picked up on over the last several months. And you reached out to me at least 6 months ago, if not 8 months ago. It was a while ago. And yeah, and the degree to which that you're, trying to build as much momentum as you can behind it. So just how are you thinking about it, months and months, maybe even, a full year and a half ahead of your pub date?
So it's been interesting to try to develop my social media presence more. I've always been on social media and have tried to be an early adopter of it, but I really now have seen it as a way of building community and support around my work. That's been a little bit just different for me as a journalist, to be in more of a promotional capacity where I'm trying to ask people on social media to pre-order my book and to listen to my podcast or to subscribe to my newsletter. But most of it has been really around book promotion. But I find that I'm really drawn to other authors who are doing a spectacular job on social media. They're posting all the time. They're just generating kind of excitement around their book. And as I've seen other authors do that, I've seen in turn that their books have often become quite successful, partly because they've really put in that effort to build momentum and interest and excitement. And so I've really thought about how can I do that for myself and for Slip, so that I can not only promote the book, but really tell the story behind it. So I've tried to think about social media as a platform where I can really elevate the topics that I write about in the book and talk more about eating disorders, and use social media as a way of amplifying my voice as an expert in that area. But also in social media, I've been trying to tell a little bit more about the backstory of the writing process, which I find fascinating as a journalist. And so I find also that other journalists are quite interested in that. Maybe not the general readership is, but I have these different segments of audiences on social media, and I try to reach them in different ways. And for me, having a newsletter that offers weekly writing tips, as well as just my work as a professor, feels like a way of giving back to the writing community. And it makes me feel a little less sheepish about being somewhat promotional on social media, because I'm not just asking for something, I'm also giving in return.
Yeah.
So that balance of that giving and taking has freed me up to feel just a little bit more authentic when I'm, posting and publicizing the book.
Yeah, and whether we benefit from having like an in-house team to help publicize a book, what questions should writers be asking of their PR team, even asking of themselves as they look to build that momentum?
Yeah, so it's really important to recognize that you may have an in-house publicity team and they may be amazing, but so much of the onus is on the author as well. And you very often have to do a lot of publicity yourself. Sometimes there are outlets that actually prefer to hear from the author as opposed to just getting a press release or an email from a publicist. And so I always encourage writers to really advocate for themselves and to say, hey, here are the podcasts that I would really love to be on. Can you help me to reach out to them? Right. And then following up with the publicist a month or two later, depending on what your time frame is, and saying, have we heard anything from these different podcasts? Similarly, doing that with newsletters, doing that with publications who you hope will review the book. I was very deliberate about having a detailed spreadsheet of all the different places that I would want to have the book pitched to. And I separated it out by media platform. And fortunately, my publicist was very good about going in and kind of updating who she had reached out to and when. But there was a certain point where I said, well, you're not hearing back from these folks. Is it okay if I reach out? And she said, yes, go for it. So in those cases, I then reached out and sometimes ended up getting yeses. So don't take silence as a no, and also recognize that you can't just expect your publicist to do everything because your publicist is working with a lot of other authors. And so you as the author have to be really creative about thinking about who you want to reach out to, and also thinking about who are some of these tangential audiences that may not be the first people who come to mind when you think about your book, but who could still end up benefiting from reading it. So as I've thought about podcasts, for instance, I've certainly thought about wanting to speak on eating disorder conferences because that's the topic of my book. But I've also thought about what are all the different podcasts that talk about writing and editing? What are podcasts that talk about menopause? Because we know that eating disorders can often come into play with menopause. What about parenting podcasts? We know that parents are often wondering what are the warning signs around eating disorders. So really being creative in terms of the different ways in which the topic of your book can relate to other topics that are related or tangential in some way.
Yeah, I would think even like endurance and running podcasts would be good for your book too, because so many endurance athletes, wrestle with disordered eating and everything. So, I like your thinking around. Yeah, there are these little. You can really diversify the reach, with your theme, even though it might not like immediately feel germane, but it really does, play a part into the holistic view of a publicity push.
Yes, definitely. And I did decide to hire a freelance publicist because it felt just appropriate to me just to be able to get a little bit more support. And I mean, you hear about these PR agencies that are just astronomically expensive, and mine was more reasonably priced for what I was looking for. But she's been incredibly helpful in getting me on podcasts because a lot of times with bigger five publishers, they're really only going after the big name folks, the big name publications, whereas you get a freelance publicist who may be more open to pitching some of these smaller podcasts or newsletters that may not have huge followings, but have dedicated followings. And so it certainly is a lot more work on the author's part if you get a freelance publicist who's a hustler and who gets lots of opportunities for you, because it means you're going to be on a ton of podcasts or answering a ton of Q&As for newsletters. But if you're willing to invest that time and you have the bandwidth to do so, it can make a really big difference. Of course, the book's not out yet in my case, so it's hard to know what that difference actually looks like. But I can tell that all this work that I'm doing is hopefully building this momentum to the point where people will say, I've seen that book in a lot of different places. Maybe I should actually order it or pick it up.
How did you vet your freelance publicist?
So I was kind of asking around. I certainly asked my literary agent, who I really trust and love, and asked for her thoughts on whether or not it would even make sense to hire a freelance publicist. And she had sent me just some different agencies. And then I just talked with a few other author friends as well, just to get a sense of whether or not they had gone in this direction. Most of them had not. But I also just decided that I wanted this and that I wanted to go with an individual, someone who sort of did this on their own as opposed to going with one of the bigger agencies, because typically those bigger agencies come with more dollar signs.
Mhm.
So I went with a publicist whose newsletter I follow and who I know has a really good reputation in the field. She had worked previously at big five publishing houses. And so I felt like I could trust her. I had led some of, or worked just on kind of doing some research into her and had attended some of her training. So I felt pretty confident given her reputation that she'd be a good person to go with.
Yeah, and with author platform, like yeah, platform is so key. I've come to understand that it's to me it's more valuable than anything, especially the permission based side of platform. A lot of authors are just discouraged by the time it takes to build like a really fruitful one. Like I tell people about this podcast, like I started this thing in 2013. Like it's an old podcast, and it's been a slow burn pod. It still is a slow burn pod. It's always going to be. But like when I say it's been like a dozen-year build, like that, people are just like, oh fuck, like I want my platform to be robust and strong in 3 months. So I don't know. Just when you're thinking about platform and a holistic approach to it, what can authors and writers, learn from your experience and how you approached it, so maybe they can approach it with a bit of a, with some positivity and energy, because it really is, it's truly how, most people are going to sell their books. You need that built-in audience.
You do. And you can get it on different platforms. I find that I have different interactions with folks depending on the platform that I'm on. There are some folks who I've really connected with on LinkedIn. There are others who have really just connected with me on Instagram. And these are individuals who I don't really know, but who have seen my work and who have just pre-ordered the book and who are planning to join my book tour events. And so that's been really meaningful to me because I don't have a huge following. I don't have a massive platform, but I'm very engaged with the folks who do follow me on these different platforms, and I post regularly. So people come to expect that from me. Whereas before I started all these publicity efforts, I would post here and there, but I didn't have a real strategy around it. And it's not like I have a written strategy for how I approach social media, but I've been a lot more mindful about it and have experimented more. So I've posted a lot more Instagram stories, a lot more videos, and just trying to figure out what sticks, knowing that some stuff works and then other stuff that I think is going to be really successful doesn't end up getting that many views. And so it's been a lot of trial and error. I also just signed up to kind of join Substack and created a newsletter last year. And that was helpful in the sense that I had turned in my manuscript and then felt this kind of emptiness because I realized, oh, I don't have my manuscript to work on anymore. So how do I keep up with this writing routine? So soon after that, I started my newsletter, which was a great way to just keep that writing routine going. And initially I thought, oh, I'm going to get a lot of subscribers. And I mean, like you said, it's been somewhat of a slow trickle, and I have a lot of followers, but in terms of subscribers, I have about 800, but those 800 folks do tend to read the newsletter. A lot of them comment. I can tell that it's having some sort of impact. And my hope is that that just continues to grow as more people recommend the newsletter, as more people get exposed to the book and my work. So it's important to just remember that a lot of times things are just this slow accumulation, and then you figure out what works, what doesn't, and you hope that you're always moving in that direction of this sort of upward trajectory.
Yeah, I think a good way to think about it, as depressing as it might feel in the moment, is to really think of it as like a 10 or a 15 or a 20-year arc of this. Not like, oh, I got to try to get 10,000 people on a list in 6 months for this book, otherwise it's going to fail. It's like, okay, this one is a step towards this bigger arc. You got to see it as a long game in such a quick hit, certainly algorithmically driven social media society. Everything feels so instant, but it's like, nah, we gotta plant these trees and give them the time to grow. Because that like you said, that those 800 people, like, I guess to me that's a lot, but maybe on paper to an agent it's like, oh, it's only 800, but they're engaged. Like, give me 800 engaged people, and they are going to be the evangelical for your work, because they'll buy 2 or 3 copies, and it's like, okay, that has the heft of someone with 20,000 because they're so engaged.
Yes, exactly. And just as we're talking, it makes me think about how this also translates to the actual book publication, because for many of us, myself included, it's easy to just want to be on the New York Times bestseller list or the USA Today bestseller list and to try to just get an amazing number of week one sales. But it's important to remember too that obviously those lists are really hard to get on. And there can be this really nice long tail in terms of the impact of a book, where maybe it doesn't really necessarily get a ton of sales in that first week or that first month, but over time, it continues to sell, right? And then you get these bumps and you realize that, oh, this book has staying power, right? And
Yeah.
cumulatively over time, that can be really meaningful when you think about just the longer term impact of a book. You don't get that instant gratification of saying, oh, I got on this bestseller list, or I hit it out of the park with week one sales. But you can think about, what does it mean to really just have the lifespan of this book continue, right, throughout the years?
You kind of alluded to it with starting your Substack after your book was kind of done and you were kind of done with it for a while. And similarly with the front runner, like I was in a post book funk for a long time. Like it just was this weird vacuum, this weird space of really unmoored and not knowing really what to do with myself. So how did you handle your post submission, post book blues? You alluded to the Substack, but how else did you metabolize that time to like kind of get your bearing again?
It was challenging because, again, I've felt like there was something missing because I'd been working on the manuscript for so long, but there were so many different kind of reviews and edits that the book went through that I didn't actually have a whole lot of time where I wasn't working on the book, to be honest. I mean, I turned it in June of 2024, and then my editor got back to me within a month. And so during that month, I thought I was going to take a break from the book, but I ended up working on my author's questionnaire for the publisher and started to think about publicity and marketing and started to envision what the newsletter would look like. And then very quickly got my edits and started working through those. And then there was a series of copy edits, and there was a kind of cold reader who had looked at it, and I had to make some edits for that. I also had a sensitivity reader, I had a fact checker, I had all these different folks as well as early readers who were looking at the book. So I was still very much engaged in editing the book and working with the manuscript for even months after the fact. And we really didn't finish all these small edits until spring of 2025 or early 2025. So it was a good 6 months of just working through edits. And these weren't substantial line edits, but it was a lot of just like little nitty gritty details that we were working through. And as a perfectionist, I kept going through. And I mean, I had 3 different passes and had all these different opportunities to make little tiny edits. My ability to make those just got smaller and smaller as we got closer to publication. But I appreciated that my publisher was really willing to involve me in that part of the process. I remember my editor saying, sometimes people don't even look at the second pass, right? Or the third pass, but I just wanted to go through and see, okay, are there any remaining typos? But so I was very much still working through the book. And then once that editing process ended, then I pretty quickly went into full on marketing and publicity mode. So maybe I should have given myself a little bit more of a buffer, or a little bit more of a break in between these different phases. But I feel like I've just lived and breathed this book for so long, and it just is so important to me that it has never really felt like work. Some people have said, oh, have you gotten tired of reading the book after all these edits? And I said, I don't know if there's something wrong with me, but no, I'm not tired of reading it yet. And I'm still not. I'm rereading it now that I'm about to go on tour. So for me, I've just felt like I've just continuously been engaged with it, but it's been a little bit of a lighter lift. Certainly writing it was hard and heavy because of the subject matter.
For sure. And you brought up a sensitivity reader and a fact checker. When did you feel confident inviting that into the fold?
So I had a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which really enabled me to be able to hire some additional folks who could support me in the process. So I used that grant funding to hire a fact checker because it's crazy, but typically publishers do not have in-house fact checkers. They have copy editors. But as a journalist, I just really wanted this to be both rigorously reported and fact checked. So hired a fact checker, hired a sensitivity reader, also hired a science advisor who could
Mm.
really look at the science in the book and make sure that I was writing about things accurately. So this was a clinician who was both an eating disorder psychiatrist and an expert in the neurobiology of eating disorders. So I had been talking with these individuals throughout the process, and particularly the science advisor. She had looked at an earlier draft and had some really helpful revisions for me. And then once I finished my draft, which was the version that I sent to my publisher, at that point, I then had the fact checker, the sensitivity reader, and the science advisor really look through that final version so that they could be looking at it at the same time that my publishing editor was looking at it. And then I could really kind of just work on those edits all at once.
Mm.
I think writers have different kind of processes for that in terms of when they choose to invite people into the process. But for me, I didn't want to be having to work through just a ton of different edits at various points of the process. It was easier for me to tackle them all at once.
Mm. Cool. Yeah, and in this book too, like when you're saying you're inviting, science advisors, sensitivity readers, fact checkers, on the surface, it's a memoir of your eating disorder and being in the middle place, that spectrum of recovery. So you would think, okay, maybe it's merely a personal story, but it was very intentional on your part to really bring in a journalistic lens to this book. So when did you know you were doing something that was using your story as a springboard to then bolster with a lot of research?
So I initially conceived of this project as being a literary memoir, and I envisioned that it would be a memoir that would look at my own life, and I would do some reporting, but that reporting would be mostly around my own life story. So I would go back and interview medical doctors who treated me. I would interview my family members. And so when my agent and I sent my proposal to editors, that's how we pitched it, as a literary memoir. And we started to get rejections. We got a lot of rejections, in fact, 17. And I felt certainly dejected, particularly when it's a memoir. It's hard
Mm.
not to
Yeah.
take it personally because it is such a personal endeavor and pursuit to write a memoir. But the feedback was not terribly consistent. Some people said that I just didn't have a big enough platform. Someone said they would have liked more social commentary. Several people said that they just didn't think they could get the book beyond modest sales because they said memoir is really tough to sell. And I essentially just felt like these editors were trying to get at something that I couldn't quite understand. And so essentially we said, okay, we've gotten no's from all the editors. So we're going to have to just take a break right now. And around that same time, there was this term that was beginning to emerge, which was Memoir-Plus, this idea that big five publishers in particular were not really acquiring as many memoirs unless they're written by famous people or folks with huge platforms. And so to get a book deal for a memoir, you had to kind of think more along the lines of memoir plus reportage or memoir plus investigation or memoir plus social commentary. So I began to think through what would my plus be. And I decided quite quickly that that plus would be reporting because I am a journalist by trade. So I ended up deciding that I wanted to interview folks with lived experience, but I didn't know really many people who had had eating disorders. So I decided to launch a survey, and I ended up surveying over 700 people with lived experience from around the world. And I was able to then start interviewing some of these individuals. And I, at the same time, was reworking my proposal and reworking it to say that I would write a narrative nonfiction book that would blend personal narrative with this reporting that I was doing. I didn't use the term memoir plus because at the time it was still somewhat nascent. And I was afraid to use memoir too much. So I gravitated toward narrative nonfiction. Sometimes you have to see what's really popular in terms of the verbiage in the publishing publishing world at any given point in time. Now I refer to my book as a memoir because the average reader doesn't really know what narrative nonfiction is.
Yeah.
So I call it a memoir now, but at the time I didn't. But I went back on proposal and submission. And this was 1 year after we'd gone on submission the first time around and still got more rejections, but finally got interest from a Simon and Schuster imprint. And I will say that, along the way, there were some potential opportunities, but I ultimately passed on them. So, for instance, at one point, an editor had said, well, we think that we could actually sell this book more if you were to co author it with an eating disorder expert, with a clinician. And I just said, I don't want this book to be clinical, nor do I want to co author it. So I'm going to just not do that. And so sometimes you have to be willing to pivot, right? But you also don't want to just kind of completely disregard your vision for the book because you need to stay true to that. So I fortunately was able to go with an editor and publisher who really believed in this book, which was super important. But it took about 35 rejections to get to that point.
Mm. Yeah, that's crazy because when and this is something you worked on in your MFA too at Goucher, and when you're working so hard on these things, you'll almost take like any compromise to get to see it through, to see it published. Just because you're so many, just like, yeah, I got to get this thing seen between two covers, but then you're really selling your vision short of it. So yeah, sticking to your guns in that regard, following your gut, it clearly paid off, but it's really hard to do in the moment.
It is. It's really hard to do, but it's important too, because if you're writing a book that doesn't align with your vision and it's not the book you want to write, it is going to be a slog and you're not going to ultimately be as proud of it. So for me, that willingness to pivot and include more reporting was really important because it still felt true to my vision for the book. I liked this idea of doing the additional reporting, and I ultimately think it made for a much better book because I learned so much in the process of reporting on eating disorders. And I thought I was an expert on the topic as someone with lived experience, but it turns out that there was so much I didn't know. So to be able to bring that reporting aspect into the proposal when we went out on that second round of submissions was incredibly important. And it was that additional reporting that I think ultimately led me to getting a book deal.
Yeah, the way you braid it, I think, is especially astute and and well done because we're grounded in your story, but then I used that word earlier, bolstered by this other stuff, by the surveys, by tracking the trajectory of the research and the therapy of it from the time that you were 11 years old when this comes with the onset of this, when you were so young to where it is now. And I think your book tracking that arc as well was just a wise move. This way we get your story and then we take a little break and then we learn a bit more of the nuance and some of the granularity of the stuff, and then we come back to you, and it's this good give and take that keeps the momentum going and keeps you coming back to it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I really had to think about the structure of the book, and the way that I structured it is different from any other books that I've seen. So I didn't really have a roadmap in terms of other books that I could look to for counsel, but I certainly got some inspiration from books like The Night of the Gun by David Carr and other books that bring together both personal narrative and reporting. But for me, I ultimately took this split chapter approach where the first half of each chapter is very personal, it's narrative driven, it really looks at my younger years and my struggles with the eating disorder and my pathway through recovery. And then there is a visual element that kind of signals a break. And then it shifts to that reported part where I'm bringing in all of the different perspectives from folks with lived experience and all of the different interviews I did with researchers. And both halves of each chapter are unified by a central theme. So the chapter on treatment, for instance, in the first half, I'm delving deep into my first hospitalization for anorexia. And then in the second half, I'm looking at the evolution of care and how treatment has evolved since the late 90s when I was first hospitalized. And for me, that structural approach took a little while to figure out, but ultimately it gave me a lot of freedom as a writer because I was able to go really deep into the personal narrative and then really deep into the reporting. And it worked because my book really is equal parts narrative and reporting. A lot of times you have a book that's mostly one or the other, but this was really equally parts both. But the other value in that structural approach was that I was able to almost have my different selves be in conversation with each other. So it was almost as if my younger self could be in conversation with my present day self because the personal parts were largely written from the perspective of my younger self, and the second parts were written more from the present day. So I loved that kind of idea of the selves being in conversation with one another. And I loved really being able to experiment with structure. And my hope is that it gives other writers who are doing this work some inspiration for how they may approach their own books.
Well, speaking of yourselves being in conversation with each other, part of what amazed me in the reading of it was that you have all these journals from like your whole life, really. And so you're able to really get into the mind of 11, 12, 13-year-old Mallary. And is when you entered those texts, who do you see now from a 30-year remove?
Yeah, so those journals were like a gold mine. My father had found them in the attic when I was at Goucher College getting my MFA and beginning to really work on this book. And the timing was quite fortuitous because for years I had asked him if he could find the journals, and he kept saying he couldn't find them. Maybe he just didn't want to because they were from a really hard time in our
Yeah.
lives. But I found them, and they were incredibly painful to read because I kept just really detailed journals throughout all of the years that I was in treatment. And it was hard to get through them. It felt like I was climbing this emotional Mount Everest. And I initially tried to read them all out loud so I could just record me reading them. But that proved to be too difficult. So I ended up silently reading with them and then just marking up the different passages that I wanted to consider including in the book. And I did include quite a few passages, but it really helped me to get into my headspace of my younger self. It helped me to corroborate memory. And it also helped me to really recreate scenes because there were so many details in these journals that I had long since forgotten. Like there was this one moment where I was writing about this spa night that we had in the residential treatment facility where I lived for a year and a half. And in a journal entry about that, I had the name of the different nail polish colors that we were using. And I wrote that I was painting my nails with a Calypso coral nail polish. And I thought, there's no way I would have ever remembered that. But there it is in the journal, right? And so then I was able to put that on the page and really make that scene come to life more because I had all these vivid details. It was as if even then I knew that I would one day want to write about these experiences. So those journals really did feel like gifts to my present day self. And they also helped me to see just how far I've come and also how sick I was. So there was one passage I remember including in the book where I just essentially said, I don't deserve the light. And I remember I would sit in the dark literally and write some of these journal entries because I didn't think I was deserving of actual light. And part of my recovery was figuring out how do you let the light back in? There was another journal entry in which I really just talked about how I missed my mom, and I would write to my mom and then I would include her responses in a different color ink. And that for me was fascinating to look at what that was like because my eating disorder started after my mom died. And I actually included some of those passages of me writing to my mom in the book. So these journals were hugely helpful in terms of re-inhabiting my younger self.
How did the light start to crack back in?
Mm. So it really was when I was in residential treatment. I had been hospitalized 5 different times and was in this revolving door of treatment. And my doctor suggested that I needed a higher level of care. So I went to this residential treatment program in Arlington, Massachusetts, and was there for a year and a half. Fortunately, the public school system and the Department of Mental Health covered the expenses, or else there's no way that my father, as director of housekeeping at a nursing home, would have been able to pay for so much care. But it was there that I began to reconnect with different parts of myself because really the eating disorder just begun to take over my whole identity to the point where I just didn't want to socialize. I didn't see myself as anything beyond the girl with anorexia. And so I needed to think about the ways in which I was special apart from my disorder, and to think about who else am I outside of anorexia, and how can I begin to see the eating disorder not as the solution, but really as the problem. And a big part of my recovery and letting that light back in was also learning to grieve my mother's death, because a big part of the eating disorder was just a result of a lot of suppressed grief. And so finally in treatment, I was able to cry and scream and get mad and think about, why did my mother have to die? And in what ways did I think that this eating disorder could help me to be closer to her? And in my recovery, how can I find other ways of maintaining that closeness without needing to rely on disordered behaviors?
Yeah, to give people who haven't read it an idea of the degree to which you didn't grieve. Like, you were in school the day after your mom passed away, and then you came home from school and were alone for 2 hours, and by yourself, with no support network. And then, one part that really kind of ripped my heart out too was like, you didn't cry or emote, and your father wanted to, but he was kind of mirroring you, and not wanting to break down because he saw how strong you appeared. And I was just like, oh my God, this. Here was the missed opportunity to start that grieving process, which could have saved you, like, probably, years and years and years of pain.
Yes. And that was a big part of my reporting process, was going back and talking to my dad about that period. For a long time, I felt anger toward him for not stepping in and for not telling me that I should cry. But as a parent, I found that I could empathize with him a little bit more at this point in my life. And I ended up talking with him and asking him these really tough questions around, why didn't you cry? Or why didn't you think it was weird that I wasn't crying? And we had this just really heartfelt series of conversations that were difficult to have, but ultimately it helped me to understand his perspective more. And what I ended up doing in the book was I recreated that conversation as a dialogue. I didn't want to just write about that conversation. I wanted readers to actually hear my father's voice and to hear how the conversation played out. So dialogue ended up being a really helpful writing tool in that sense.
Yeah. You said kind of a moment ago where you couldn't, well, your identity was so like inextricably tied to anorexia. And this is kind of common, but you referred to it kind of like as a friend, and it's like this thing that is like bound to you in a way. Like, maybe like just pull on that thread a little more, how this thing, how it becomes to be seen as a friend, malicious as it is.
Yeah, so this is very common among people with eating disorders, where they do tend to think about the disorder as a friend, even though in many ways it is a foe. But the eating disorder, in some way, shape, or form, serves a purpose, right? I mean, otherwise we wouldn't have fallen into the eating disorder. And for me, it was a way to stay small and safe in the aftermath of my mother's death. And I thought that if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, maybe I could somehow be closer to her. And for a time, it did help me to feel closer to her, because as I think back on that period, my most accessible memories of my mother were of her sick in a hospital bed, unable to eat because she was so sick with cancer that she had literally lost her appetite. And when I went back and looked at her old medical records, she had been diagnosed as positive for anorexia. That is not anorexia nervosa, which is what I struggled with, but positive for anorexia is just a clinical term that doctors use when someone has cancer, for instance, and they've lost their appetite because of it. But I remember her losing weight, being in the hospital, and then fast forward a year and a half, and I was sick with an anorexia of my own in the hospital. And I remember feeling closer to my mom from that hospital bed, because I remembered her being there, and the hospital felt like very familiar territory to me. So there was this sort of feeling that anorexia was giving me something. It also did give me a sense of control. I couldn't control what I put or what happened to my mom's body, but I could control what I put into mine. And so it felt like the anorexia was acting as a friend in some ways, but it also had taken away so much from me. And at a certain point, it was not lost on me that I had developed my eating disorder as a way to stay small. And this disorder ended up growing unbearably big. And I ended up feeling more out of control than ever. So that's important to, I think, in recovery, really reckon with what did the eating disorder give you and what did it ultimately take away?
Yeah, there's a part in my Gallium, 102 pages in, where as you're starting to gain some of your weight back, you said the more I gained, the more distant I felt from both my mother and my disorder. So it was like in the healing came this I don't know, a vacancy or like a separation anxiety to these things that you were bound to as you were getting healthier, like objectively healthier. Here you were fearing you were going to lose a connection like these, to your mom and the disorder itself.
Right, because recovery seemed so daunting because I thought, well, if I recover, then I will no longer have these connections to my mom and I won't have my eating disorder at all either. So, who am I going to be? Right.
Right.
And so that question of identity really came into play there.
Yeah, and it's one part that it was early on. Your mom had passed away, and I thought it was kind of like what your dad did, like just in his grief and just not knowing what to do with with his daughter. Like he subscribes you to 17 magazine, and I was like, it was such like a cute, heartwarming gesture. It's just like I'm picturing I don't know, someone in their probably mid to late 30s, like trying to like, oh my God, here's my 11-year-old daughter. Like, what can I do to help her out? He's like, oh, maybe I'll get her subscription to this magazine, and this will help. Like, I could feel the love in that.
Yes. Yeah. And that was really interesting too, because I think over time we tend to simplify narratives. And for the longest time, I said my mom's death caused my eating disorder. But then when I was getting my MFA at Goucher, I had a professor who said, is that really what caused it? And that question did prompt me to think about the other elements at play. And one of those elements was the 17 magazine. And I remember distinctly, I was sitting in an MFA class and I started to Google the first issue of 17 that I ever got because I remember exactly when it was. It was 2 months after my mom had died. And I looked at this image of this magazine, and the cover story was girls who exercised themselves to death.
Mm.
And I ended up on eBay just purchasing a copy of this particular issue as well as several others and read this story. And it was all about girls with eating disorders. It was about girls who compulsively exercised and didn't eat. And I thought, that was probably my first exposure to eating disorders. And then I flipped to the back of the magazine and was immediately reminded of all the really pernicious ads in the back of these teen magazines where they would advertise fat camps and weight loss strategies for young girls as young as 7 years old. And to think about those influences
Yeah.
was really just eye opening for me as a writer. And it helped me to complicate the narrative, and that complicating of the narrative is not something I'd done before, but the form of the book and just the real estate I had to work with was so much more vast than any time that I'd written in the past, because previously I'd really only written these short personal essays, but I had so much more room to roam and to really look at all these different elements that played into the eating disorder. And for me as a writer, that was really fascinating.
Yeah, and a lot of this book, it focuses on this idea of a middle place where you're not like full recovery, but you're, between full recovery and a relapse. And in between there is this wide spectrum of healing and care and recovery. So just like take us to what the middle place is and how you've come to move within those boundaries.
Yeah, so the middle place is not something that's really talked about at all in eating disorder literature, and yet it's so important. And I found that whenever I would read books about eating disorders, there was often this lack of a mirrored image because I didn't see my story reflected in those books because they were by and large written by people who were fully recovered. And so for a long time, I thought I was the only person in this gray space between acute sickness and full recovery. And once I started doing reporting for the book, and when I surveyed over these 700 plus people, 85% of them said, I can identify with this middle place. So I thought, this place seems quite populous, and yet we're not talking about it. Why is that? So in the book, I explore the why behind that, but I also really talk about this framework. And the middle place is really a term I came up with to describe the ongoingness of recovery from an eating disorder, because while full recovery can be possible for some, we know that eating disorders can be chronic for many, and many people end up kind of in this space where they are better, but not all better. And as a writer, I was really intrigued by these questions of what does it mean to be better, but not to be over your disorder? And what does it mean to live in this world knowing that your disorder remains a vulnerability? So, part of why I titled the book Slip is to recognize that slips are a normal part of the process. And yet, at least within the eating disorder field, they are so often stigmatized to the point where people don't want to talk about them. And the middle place is really about thinking about how you can normalize slips and look at slips not as grounds for failure, but as opportunities for growth. And that framing has been really helpful for me in terms of my own recovery, because it makes recovery seem like less of a perfectionistic ideal and more of an accessible reality.
Yeah, and speaking of that vulnerability of the middle place and who you're writing this book for, to what extent did you wrestle with the idea that maybe the book is going to be very triggering to people?
It's something I thought about a lot because I did not want this book to be a guidebook for people with eating disorders. There's certainly some books that have been criticized just as being too triggering or giving people really harmful ideas about how they can be better at their eating disorders. So I did not want that to be the case. And yet I didn't want to skirt over hard truths. So very often I would delve into some of the harmful behaviors that I engaged in. But then in that latter half of each chapter, where I was writing from my present day perspective, I was then able to say, okay, that behavior led to these other kind of destructive thoughts, or those landed me in a really bad spot, or those led to consequences in the treatment center. And I didn't want to have to do that when I was writing from the perspective of my younger self, because I didn't want my adult self chiming in and saying, well, that wasn't good or that was bad. But in that second half of the chapter, I could more freely do that. So I tried to make those connections, not in sort of a didactic or prescriptive way, but in a more subtle way to show the repercussions of those really harmful behaviors that I had engaged in. I was also careful not to include numbers. So I never talked about how much I weighed at any given point in time. And that was just something that I made a very conscious decision about. But I will say that what's triggering for one person may not be triggering for another. So, for instance, if I had included my weight at various points, that may not have been as triggering for someone as some of the other details that I included are. So, I think it's just important to recognize that our triggers are different for everyone. But if we are going into great detail about something that could be triggering, thinking about ways that we can creatively show the side effects or repercussions of those behaviors can be really important.
It sounds weird saying, but one of my favorite moments in the book is when your kids are reading the Berenstain Bears, like basically body shaming story, and your reaction and like kind of like the horror of this, because you're like seeing this as a potential inflection point on your children, you know, probably specifically your daughter. And I just that one's like struck out to me. I was just like, holy shit, here you are at your point in your journey, and then you see like this thing, and, you know, innocent to them, but you could see the how pernicious it is. I don't know, just like, you know, take us there, and, you know, to what, you know, the horror you were experiencing.
Yeah. So the last chapter of the book is all about motherhood and also about the genetics of eating disorders. And it looks at why I am nervous about my kids potentially getting an eating disorder one day, not because of any behaviors they've exhibited, but just because of the genetics of it. But I talk about just how I have tried so hard to protect them from ever developing this disorder. And at one point, they were reading this Berenstain Bears book that was published in 1985, which was the year that I was born. And I very likely could have read it as a child because I loved the Berenstain Bears. But the title of this book was Too Much Junk Food. And my son and had picked it up from the library unbeknownst to me. And then I heard my daughter reading it to him on the couch, and it was talking about how the Berenstain Bears had gotten too wide from side to side because they were eating too many treats. And to hear my daughter talking in this way just made my blood boil. And I wasn't angry at her, but I was angry at the messaging because it was so firmly rooted. There we go. It was so rooted in diet culture and fat phobia. And I thought again, oh, I'm sure I was exposed to that as a kid, but I didn't know any better than to think that there was something wrong with that message. And I very quickly stepped in and just pulled the book out of my daughter's hand. And I said, we're not reading that. And I hid it in the top shelf of my closet. And my kids were upset with me because I'd taken the book away and they didn't understand why. And later on that night, I apologized and I just explained that that book runs contrary to the messaging that I like to share with them, which is this idea that all foods fit and all bodies are worthy of respect, no matter how short or tall, no matter how big or small. And that, in many ways, is eating disorder prevention speak, but it also is just what I want my kids to learn and come to understand, knowing that they are at greater risk than the average child.
Oh, for sure. Well, Mallory, kind of bringing it back to the writing and what it means to be a writer and stuff of that nature. What as we kind of bring this conversation down for a little landing, I've been liking getting a sense of some of the best maybe writing advice that you've either received or just hard won that you like to give people if given that platform. So just for you, what is some of the better writing advice that you've experienced?
Yeah. So for me, just thinking about this idea of taking risks and really being as honest, as brutally honest as possible is so important. And it's not been one particular person who has told me that, but it's just in reading different memoirs that I've been able to just get the sense that these folks are really being vulnerable on the page. One person who does that really well is Suleika Jawad, who wrote Between Two Kingdoms. And she shared this quote once where she said, if you want to write a good book, then write what others don't know about you. But if you want to write a really great book, then write what you don't want to know about yourself. And I just loved that advice because it made me think, I need to do a lot of just reflection on what I am willing to share. And I really lay bare so much in this book that I've never shared publicly before. There were so many times where I'd write essays previously, but they would be rooted almost in just partial truths where I wasn't really telling the full story of where I'm actually at in my recovery. And often I would write those essays as if I were fully recovered or as though the eating disorder were a thing of the past when it's not. It's still something I contend with. And so to write this book in a way that aligned my two selves, right, in a way that really authentically captured my story was so refreshing as a writer because for so long I had told people I was fully recovered and yet I wasn't. And there was this misalignment between the narrative I shared publicly and the one that I lived out in private. Whereas this book really just is in alignment with who I really am. And for me, that took a lot of reflection. It took a lot of vulnerability, but ultimately made for a much better book.
Excellent. And yeah, I think, as you know, as someone who listens to the show occasionally, I like asking for a recommendation too for the listeners out there. And that's just anything that you're enjoying that you want to share with them. So I extend that to you, Mallory.
Sure. So I really like the work of Megan O'Rourke. She's an editor at the Yale Review, and she's a poet and a memoirist. But I am now rereading her book, The Invisible Kingdom, which is about her struggles with autoimmune disorders. And both Between Two Kingdoms from Suleika Jawad and The Invisible Kingdom are nods to Susan Sontag's seminal work on illness as metaphor, where she talks about how we all inhabit a kingdom of the sick and the kingdom of the well. And so I'm always intrigued by just the invisibility of certain kingdoms, right? It aligns with my thinking around the middle place. But this book, The Invisible Kingdom, does a really beautiful job of blending the personal narrative with reporting. So it's been a real just beacon of light for me. And I'm rereading it now just to, again, jog my memory of what I loved about it so much.
Oh, excellent. Well, Mallory, I truly enjoyed Slip. I know I loved it, and it was it was like it's funny. It's like such a heavy topic so I was almost like I hate to say like I was entertained and thought it was a great read, but it was, even though it's a heavy topic. I feel like I'm rooting for your pain or something. Like, this is a great book, but
No,
but it
I
was.
totally
It
get
was a
what you're
great
saying.
book. So I just thank you for the work and for putting it out there, and I wish you the best of luck with it.
Thank you so much.
Just never gets old to me, man. Thanks to Mallary. Thanks to you, kind listener. See you never. And we can always take more ratings and reviews of the podcast. Leaving kind reviews and ratings for the front runner on Amazon or Goodreads will certainly help. Consider signing up for Pitch Club on Substack. Welcome to pitchclub.substack.com and the flagship Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. You can also find the embed forms at brendanamaro.com. Now, before I get into this, please don't listen to this as if I'm fat shaming anyone. Health is a spectrum. Bodies exist on a spectrum. And just because you're objectively skinny doesn't mean you're healthy. And just because you might be a bit heavier doesn't mean you're unhealthy. Okay? So for like ever, I've had major issues with my body shape, body image. It was imprinted on me from a pretty young age and will likely need like a lot of therapy to suss out. But who has the time? My mother could always be seen doing crunches and stuff between commercials of like MacGyver, Golden Girls, or whatever the hell, when I was growing up. And like a lot of women, especially women of her age and her generation, most of her value or perceived value was from her looks. She was voted most attractive in her high school graduating class. She graduated in the 50s. And every morning when I would wake up for school, there was some aerobics show on television. So I often was watching Denise Austin or Body by Jake and these aerobics classes on the beach, while I ate my Honey Nut Cheerios, raised on He-Man and Hulk Hogan. Despite being pretty athletic and coordinated, I was never super lean. Like, I would go to the doctor and he would always kind of like poke and prod at me, and my mom would kind of try to defend me. Like, no, he's not fat, he's big boned. Big boned. I think that's a good title for a memoir. Yeah, so I was always a little thick through the middle, despite wanting so desperately to have a chiseled abdomen, because I so desperately wanted girls to like me and notice me. And this was the way. And I thought the only way would be to look like a Men's Health cover model. 1 year I wanted and received the AbWorks machine for Christmas. Yeah, it was this hinged thing with handles to do crunches. I did a set and I ran upstairs. It was Christmas Day. I did a set, ran upstairs and asked my sister and mother, like, can you see the definition of my stomach? And they laughed. This did nothing for my confidence. To be clear, this obsession never manifested in the kind of maniacal devotion to actually like execute, to be like, I'm going to do whatever it takes to look like that, like true bulimia or anorexia nervosa, though it very well could have gone in that direction. Yeah, to this day, I've never quite achieved the physique I've ever dreamt of or long dreamed of. My appetites for beer and junk food and sleeping are just too strong. My relationship to, quote, good food and, quote, bad food was and is so messed up that I'm caught in this awful tension between what I, quote, should eat, what I do eat, and the shame that often elicits. If I know there are a package of Oreos in the house in a cabinet somewhere, I can hear them talking to me. And I will eat them just to get them out of the house. Right now, there is a pint of ice cream in the freezer of non-dairy fish food, and it is ringing in my ears, and it's worse than tinnitus or whatever. Like, I just know it's there. I can hear it talking to me. I once ate so much mac and cheese at a friend's wedding that I threw up because I have this scarcity mindset around food that I won't get mine. And I wasn't even drinking. I just ate so much food, my body had nowhere to put it except out of my fucking mouth. And I didn't grow up with 5 brothers who were like wrestling over the food. And if you didn't get yours, you were not going to eat. I was basically an only child. And I would just eat so fast. My mom would often say, like, why don't you slow down? Like, enjoy your food, chew your food. But I was just like this Pac-Man. And I just this mindset that if I don't chug my food and get seconds as fast as possible, I won't ever feel sated. Like even in college when I, let's say like 3 or 4 of my friends were there and we'd get the aircraft carrier boneless chicken wings from the hangar in Amherst. Like I would just try to eat so many so fast. Like I might eat 10 as fast as I could to make sure that I got mine while maybe the others had like, I don't know, like 3 or 4 and were just like taking their time. But on top of this, my friends, even growing up, they constantly made fun of how fat I was, even though I really wasn't that chubby. They thought it was hilarious. I did not, even though I could kick like all their asses on whatever field of play we were on for the most part, except swimming. Jesse was long as a barracuda. Yeah, they'd laugh at me, poke at me. I probably invited it. They thought it was funny how mad I'd get or how sad I'd get. Almost unilaterally, all my friends were leaner than I was too. So I was like an easy target in that regard. This is growing up in Massachusetts. In college, I was a janitor for one of the bakeries on campus, Hamden Bakery, I think. And they often left dozens of glazed donut holes on the tables when their shifts were over for us to clean up one way or the other. Left over. They figured some vulture making $8 an hour would scarf them up. And I'd eat them like they were M&Ms, just popping them like pills, man, and feel the requisite shame. Then I got the wise idea that I would chew on them, feel that pillowy sweetness, and then spit them out in the trash can for minimal calorie bleed into my stomach. My buddy John thought I was insane, but he was naturally lean, and the naturally lean with high metabolism don't usually get it. I called it pre-bulimia. Man, I was always seduced by ways to get that coveted six-pack or to chisel that body to look like a cover model. And I remember another, a friend of our roommate, he just saw the way I was built, and I'm like 24 at the time. He's like, B.O. already has his dad bod. Look at that. And I was just looking down because I guess I have a big torso and it projects a certain dad bod image. And I remember that just gutted me. Shit like that just gutted me. I knew it was never possible, but the allure was always there. I never had the confidence to fully eschew it. And when I look in the mirror, I see Grimace or SpongeBob, just this malformed, massive, weirdly proportioned characters. And here's where some of it comes from too. Like my father fat shamed everybody, especially women, when he saw them. Or if he brought up so-and-so, he'd say, she put on some weight, or he got heavy. My sister, super lean, did not inherit my endomorphic bod. Says the same things. I doubt she even knows she does it. I don't even think my dad knows he does it. And, and even my mom, she always kept these little notebooks of calorie counting, and it's every bite of food, writing things down. And with my sister, one of my nieces, one of my sister's daughters, one year, she may have been 7 or 8, I don't know, holiday season. So I'm starting to get a little thicker, I guess. She greeted me by repeatedly poking me in the stomach, kind of making like a squishy sound, which is like super inappropriate. She is, and will always be super skinny too. And objectively, I didn't look like the obesity B-roll footage you see on the news. But my torso is 90% of my body mass. That's just where it resides. And it's where I tend to hang on to excessive body weight. Both my parents are apples. Different shaped apples, but apples nevertheless. And so it's only natural that I have this internalized fat phobia, and I really hate it. It's so stupid. Someone very close to me grew up much the same way. Like she grew up similarly conditioned towards disordered eating and having to be the skinniest and the smallest, and how people judge us by how big or how small or how wimpy or jacked we are. Sometimes when I see people I haven't seen in a while and they say, oh, you look good, like I get a little high. I get a little buzz. And if I see people I haven't seen in a while and they don't say anything, I think like, wow, fuck, they must think I'm a fucking slob. And now they're talking behind my back about how I've let myself go. I hear my dad's voice saying, like, he put on some weight. As I wrote a few weeks ago, I'm quickly running out of fucks to give, as we all should. Try to extinguish those fucks. But this is a lingering fuck that is very hard for me to let go of because it runs so deep. In the culture, yes, but also just in my upbringing. Thing is, men rarely talk about this shit. This is usually the purview of the women's magazines I saw piled up in front of my mother, of losing 30 pounds in a month and how to keep it off, or get your pre-pregnancy body back, and on and on. The covers of all these magazines are so doctored with lighting and Photoshop, and people on the covers have cooks and nutritionists, and more than likely are on some kind of PED or another. Like, fuck, even the bodybuilding magazines, they show these roided out dudes, but they're often touting some supplement or protein powder as if it was that made them jacked. Sure, they got jacked with like hard work. You need hard work. It's not, the drugs don't make you big on their own, but it's also chemistry. It's such a drip. It's such a waste of headspace, especially when there's so much suffering and hunger and fascism and school shootings and other shootings. And it's like, you're concerned about how your belly looks in that t-shirt? I very rarely go swimming. I almost always wear a long sleeve shirt to the beach. If such an outing occurs, I can do better. I must. I know I need to lean down for my health. My blood pressure is pretty high, and I want my knees and body at large to feel more limber and less achy. Studies show that excess body fat on the torso can lead to a host of gnarly things. And that's where all my excess mass is, as I already established. My concerns are far less cosmetic than they used to be, and yet it's still there. This is what Mallory's book really dredged up in me. So much of the literature she cited I could relate to with dizzying synchronicity. Anyway, I figured I'd share that, whether you cared for it or not. I know it's not in any way writing advice or shit like that, but sometimes sharing a sliver of my life away from the page is within the rules. And all the more why I put these blogs, such as they are, at the end of the program. So stay wild, CNFers, and if can't do, interview. See ya!